want to talk just a little bit about drawing in general and why I find it so interesting, why I like floral drawing, a little bit of a philosophy behind it. Like, I have this kind of pulled out here as a main point that drawing is a form of intense observation, which I feel like in the world that we're in right now, Instagram Reels is what, 15 seconds or 30 seconds? Like, that's the kind of time span that our brains are used to at this point. And I think being able to draw something and like really sit there and observe it, like you might be staring at the same thing for an hour, multiple hours. Like, I don't know, I just think the thought around that is really beautiful. Like that you'd actually take the time to like sit down and really observe something that closely. I think you learn a lot about the world around you. You learn a lot about what you think about it when you really just take the time to sit and slow down. And I think that's really not the world that we're in right now. So it's all pretty fast paced and short attention span. So I think the thought behind that's really beautiful. So I also wanted to point out too that drawing is not only like a mechanical process. Like you might have the skills to draw, but you really need to like learn how to think about it, how to observe um, what you're looking at, your reference, whether it's a picture or something physical. Like, so it's really both a mental and a mechanical skill. So lots of times when I'm drawing, like if a drawing took me 2 hours, like I'm not physically drawing for the full 2 hours. Like I might be looking at my image and maybe I'll sketch something on the side, trying to figure out like how actually would I depict that. So it's both mental and mechanical skill. So I think that's important. And so we're going to be talking about how do you study your reference, how do you understand the contour, especially when it comes to flowers, observing where the light is coming from. So a lot about the light and shadow and really kind of trying to think ahead when you're drawing so you know what your next steps are and you kind of plan for those. So why floral drawing too? So I found it a little freeing, especially coming from an architecture background where architecture, like everything is very rigid. If your perspective is off, like that, that's off. Like there's no kind of wiggle room there. Like you'll be able to tell if you made a mistake. And I find with floral drawing, it's a lot more forgiving. Like nothing in nature is perfect. And I think it's actually those imperfections that make it beautiful. So as we go through this class too, I think you'll hear me say several times, like I like to actually look at a reference image. Like I can't, I don't know, I just can't draw in my head as well as some may, but I think having that reference helps me draw those imperfections, which I think makes it look more realistic because I am picking those up, because I think our brain just naturally like knows that that's how it actually is. So use some pretty basic tools. You guys got the supply list, which was pretty much just the basic ones here. I'm just going to be drawing on plain printer paper as of right now. For finished drawings, I'll use like a Bristol paper or something like pretty smooth, like a hot press watercolor. So those are kind of my papers of choice. For a pencil, just anything that you can erase easily. So usually kind of like a medium, HB, maybe getting into like a 2B or 2H, but just something that you can erase easily. I'm going to be using, when I draw, just so you can see it, probably a darker pencil. So know that what I'm doing here is just for your purposes, so you can actually see what I'm doing. Erasers. So I mean, I use just your regular plastic eraser, but I also like kneaded erasers. This I feel like kind of comes from the architecture world, but I see lots of calligraphers using kneaded erasers too. So, and I haven't even used this one yet, but I got this tiny little eraser too that just has a real fine tip, which will help kind of just erasing in small areas. So I'm excited to test that out. And this is my pencil sharpener. And I added a few extra tools here too that These are not required at all, but I just wanted to show you kind of a few advantages and things that I use. So I guess for architectural drawings, a ruler is helpful, but I also use this, say, to like find the center of my paper if I'm doing a floral drawing. Maybe my paper is bigger, but I really want it to be 8 by 10. So having a ruler, and actually I like the rolling ruler too. So that's a little something extra. I mean, you don't need it at all, but erasing shield can come in handy too. Again, another architectural tool, just so it kind of guards the rest of your drawing while you erase just small little bits. So this in combination with my small eraser, I think will work really well. As many of you know, plastic erasers like this kind of leave quite a bit of residue, so being able to wipe it off without smudging your drawing, a brush could be helpful. And a compass, not for drawing anything with your actual flower, but maybe you want to kind of figure out like an area to draw within. Maybe that's part of my composition that I kind of depict a circle and don't draw past it. So sometimes a compass might come in handy. So I just want to add a little bit of those extra tools. So if you keep drawing and want to add some to your repertoire, that might be good things to add. And pens. So you may have seen, I did a test of a few different brands of pens, and I posted something on Instagram recently about that. So I think on my tools list that I sent out, microns are still my favorite. So as far as price and quality goes, so that's usually what I use. But I encourage you to try out different brands too, depending on, say, if you draw pretty straight up and down, or maybe you draw more at an angle, a different pen may work better for you. So I encourage you to try some out. I mean, none of it was a waste, even though this one ended up being my favorite. Like I'll use all the other ones. So I mainly will be using probably the 02, usually for my outline, depending on how big you draw too. Like you'll be using probably different thicknesses of your nibs here. So I usually use about a 02 for my outline, and then the fine 005 for the detail lines. But I usually do get the packs that kind of have the full spectrum from the 005 to 08. I do use them, but those two I use the most often. For those of you who've done pencil drawing, you know, like to add some sort of shade, like you just kind of scribble it, right? And the harder you press, like if you do it real light, that's going to be a light shade. If you start either adding layers or maybe pressing harder, that's going to give you a darker shade. So obviously you can't do that for pen drawing. Like pushing harder isn't going to get you a more black line. Let me just get this a little bit closer. And so you have to create those different values in a different way. So that's where we start with the basic strokes. So I'm going to get a piece of paper here. So the basic strokes are something that I think is helpful to start with, to always go back to later. It's going to improve your drawings, the way that you practice these. It's always something that you can go back to. So I've included a couple basic strokes here. So there's more to pen drawing than just these, but I think these are the ones that I use probably the most often for floral drawings, and that kind of like a hatch is pretty much my number one go-to. A scribble can be something like I use that, say, for the center of a sunflower. Stippling, I think, looks beautiful, but I tend to just not have the patience for. But I've seen like a full rose done just in stipple, so we will talk about that too. But I know you've all seen what we're doing for our kind of goal for this, and it's not stippled, but that's something that you can play with in your own drawings too. And cross hatching, I might use that in some instances, say for a leaf that might have a little bit of texture. Maybe for a darker shadow within my flower, that might be somewhere that I might use the cross hatch. But really, hatch lines are something I think that I probably use the most. So when it comes to drawing your basic strokes, there's a few things that I think will help improve your drawings. It's kind of like the way that you practice, right? So let's get my pen out here. So just for your basic hatch, let's focus this real quick. There we go. What I want to do when I'm working on kind of improving these basic strokes is to be very deliberate kind of about how I put my pen down on the paper and how I'm picking it up. So sometimes if you do this kind of quickly, you might kind of get like little tick marks maybe on edges, or maybe the top, if I held it there too long, you might kind of get like a dot on top. So I think the first thing to kind of focus on and practice is just how your pen touches the paper and how you're picking it up. So that's first thing. And then being consistent with your spacing of your lines, because we'll get to next how you use the spacing of the lines to create value. So work on getting that consistent spacing. I'm being very intentional about where I'm placing my pen, kind of even to how long it's sitting there and where I'm picking it up. And then kind of the curvature of the line will be important too. So, I mean, I'm used to in architectural drawings having everything be super straight, but for florals, we'll get into why, but to kind of depict the contour of a petal, straight lines are not typically for floral drawings. So you're going to want to have curved lines. So that's something that you can practice too, is can I draw curved lines consistently, consistent spacing. So this is something too that I kind of relate to calligraphy, that to get those curved lines, you can use kind of your finger movement to get, if you're doing pretty short lines, so that can get you your curve. So your fingers kind of naturally make the curve in a certain direction, right? So I definitely am not one that leaves my paper in place while I'm drawing. I'm going to turn it to, if I need to make a line going this way, like I kind of want to use the natural anatomy of my body in order to make those lines in the right direction. So I know sometimes you'll see drawing videos on YouTube or on Instagram and somebody like leaves their paper perfectly in front of them. That's definitely not how I do it. If I make a video, sorry, I might make you like dizzy by turning my paper, but I always just want to, I'm being realistic about how my process is, and I don't want to change that just in order to make a video. So I'm going to be using that natural anatomy in order to make the lines the way that I need them to be. So just your finger movement will kind of get those short lines. If you're drawing something a little bit taller, maybe then you start to move your whole wrist. So your wrist is going to kind of give you that natural curve too. So I'm using more of my wrist to get that curve there, or I don't know if I've ever drawn anything quite this big, but even your elbow too kind of can get that natural curve if you're doing something really, really tall. So a couple different ways to get kind of those curved lines. Just as we get into it, you'll see why we kind of want to focus on curve rather than straight lines. So brighten up a little bit here. Okay, so different ways that you can vary your strokes. The first one we kind of talked about is spacing, which is important. So especially if you're just using a hatch, the way that you space that's going to be pretty light. If they're really close together, that's going to depict a darker shade. So you're going to want to practice different ways or different spacing of lines. So I kind of went from one extreme to the other here, but you'll want to practice kind of in betweens too. And on the next page, we'll get into making values where you're going to kind of gradiate them down and get closer and closer. So that's one way. The weight is a second way that you can vary your strokes. So with technical pens, I'm going to show The number on the lid, well, and it's on the pen too, is the thickness of your nib. So that is the way that you're going to vary the weight. So the lightest, let's just grab here. This is the 005. That's going to be your lightest line. And then you can kind of keep bumping up from there. So I will change my pen, usually for purposes of like, am I outlining or am I doing detail lines? So usually not even like within detail lines will I use this technique to vary my strokes. Usually I'll be using the spacing of the lines, but this is a way that you could do it. That would be an interesting study to see what you can do. So you could see here I'm up to the 0.3 now, and that's getting darker. Let's see if I have, here's, I have to change brands because I don't have a 0.5 next to me, but this one's darker yet. And then 0.8 is the darkest that I have. So, oops, and it looks like it's dying. So that one gets you a little bit thicker. So you can see there just the variety of different weights that you can get just by switching pens. Then I demonstrated this a little bit with kind of how to use your finger, wrist, elbow movement, but varying the size of your strokes. So is it kind of a longer one? You can kind of make layers of strokes with shorter strokes. So you might use this to make like kind of a texture, depending on what you're drawing. It might be appropriate, or you might have to do this just because the area that you're shading is so big that like you're not going to be able to get that in like one single stroke. So when I add that second layer there, you can see I'm trying to overlap my last stroke just a little bit, but not too much so that it makes like a dark area, you know, within that overlap. So trying to use this technique to make like one single shade. And I find it kind of helpful too to kind of pick up the pen at the end to make it maybe just a little bit kind of wispy at the end. So then when you overlap just that little bit, like you're not getting too much like of a darker shade within that area. Okay, and the next is direction. So is it straight up and down? If I'm going to change direction, again, I might turn my paper just to kind of keep, especially if I'm trying to make those curved lines, to just keep using that anatomy, natural anatomy to my advantage. Or you can use this to make different textures. You could see in my examples, I kind of have a little bit of a basket weave pattern. So changing that direction can really make a different look to your strokes. Maybe it's depicting a texture. When we get to kind of layers over here and cross hatching, like you can use changing your direction in order to add shade. So actually, let's just do that. So this is a good way too to add shade. So maybe my first layer is just a regular hatch. Next layer, go across it, the opposite direction. Now that looks a little bit darker. Maybe I can go at an angle, darker shade even still. And you could just keep going, adding layers. So you can add layers that way, and you could also add layers just with your regular strokes too. So here's just my hatch. Oh, I want it to be darker, so this end's darker, so I add some more layers there. Keep adding more, it gets darker. So we'll kind of go into that in this next page with how you kind of keep adding layers to get that gradation of shade. The next layer of complexity is going through and using those strokes to create different values. So how do we use those strokes to, well, white, complete white will be just nothing. And then to get that like true black, like you're going to be adding a bunch of layers to get that black. And then you need to find how to make the different values in between. So I think I read somewhere that generally 6 different values within one drawing will be enough to really give it interest. I feel like it could even be 4. Like it doesn't really have to be that many different ones. Like something to depict really dark shade. This is in direct sunlight, and then just a couple in between. I think will really give your drawing a lot of dimension. So I think starting with something like this, where you just draw them all separately, is kind of the best way to start. So since I said I used hatching most often, let's start with that. So complete bright white, will just be nothing. I'm just going to kind of draw a little scale here so I know. Let's see, there's 3. So this is just complete white. And then we want black here. So I find it pretty easy just to kind of start with my extremes and then find where my middle can be. So to get complete black for hatching, I mean, you're just going to be drawing your lines in here, and then I go back and just keep adding layers. So now I'm kind of trying to get in between those lines. I guess I could have started even closer together. So just adding more and more. More and more layers will help here. Is anybody else having issue with audio? I saw Christopher said his audio stopped working. Can everybody else hear me okay? Christopher, if you want to try to get out of the video and then come back into, I'll watch the waiting room and readmit you if you want to try that. Okay, good, thank you. Okay, so I'm kind of cheating and just using this, just the very far end here to get the black. So now the way that I create these in between shades is going to be with my spacing of my lines. So not quite black, but if I space them really close, so this would be something that's kind of like a dark gray. A little bit farther apart, you'll get kind of a middle shade. See, this is where it's important to practice your spacing of your lines, because that's going to give you those different shades. Something even farther, maybe this is like light gray, and then even farther apart, just a couple lines. So those are kind of giving you your different values. So there's 6 different values from real dark black, getting lighter, to a complete white. So this is kind of an easy way to practice that, is to start just drawing them as separate swatches. But if you see here, the kind of next, so this is more realistically what you're going to be using within your drawings, is using it kind of in a gradation. So that'll be the next thing we can practice here. And even though I said I use hatch most often, let's do a couple of the other ones too. So I'm actually just going to turn my paper over and get something a little cleaner. So I'm going to do a pretty short gradation just so we don't have to sit here. So maybe that's how long. So I'm going to go black on one side to complete white on the other. So in order to get these, what I find most helpful is to just do it in layers. So maybe white, let's see here. So I do it pretty spaced out, getting a little bit closer. And then I'm going to hit all the way black. So obviously we're not to all the way black. So now from here, I'm just going to keep adding layers and stop before I get all the way. So, because I still want to leave some of that kind of lighter. Add another layer. Stop before I get to the end. And another. Now I'm starting to get almost to the darkest black there. So this is kind of the technique that I like to use to get that gradation. Making sure I still have something kind of in that dark gray scale. And coming back in and make sure I get that full black. So as I've drawn more too, I've found I started off pretty hesitant to use like a full sort of black shade, but I've found using that sparingly usually is a great way really to add a lot of depth to your drawings and really getting a lot of contrast and pops. So when we get into it, I'll kind of show certain areas that I would use that darkest black, but usually, you know, you're somewhere in the middle. So that's just kind of messy, albeit value scale using hatching. So I kind of do a similar thing. So actually, let's just label that. So there's your hatch. And then a cross hatch. I like to do kind of the same thing, add layers. So going from a full black to a full white. So I start with my lines in one direction, making sure I tend to like not leave quite as much white in my drawings as I feel like I should. So I really have to slow myself down when I get to those areas that are in bright light and really tell myself, you know, should stop. Stop short, only draw a couple lines. So this is kind of where drawing becomes that kind of mental practice too of, I feel like I talk to myself in my head a little bit, but okay. So for cross hatching then, the way that you're going to make your dark shades is to add lines going in the other direction. So maybe I start with one layer. I don't add very much over here where I'm in that bright light. Then I go another direction. Really thinking about spacing my lines out as I get towards that white area. Just add a couple lines. No, I'm not moving my paper, well, not as much, but I'm moving my entire hand over here. Do a layer going this direction. Space them out a lot at the end. Only do a couple. And then I keep kind of add some layers, keep going through here to get to that dark black. So that's how I go through and add layers to get that cross hatching. So again, I use cross hatching, I think, a little bit more if I feel like something has a rougher texture. To me, this kind of looks a little rougher and less elegant. So I think for my florals, I use just hatch lines because I think it isn't as rough and it helps depict like the texture of the flower a little bit better for me. But you could try doing cross hatching. I've seen it done very well. I think cross hatching kind of takes a bit more control too, of like thinking about how you're making your lines, space them out, don't put too many over here. So I think it's definitely mentally a little bit more difficult than just the hatching. So definitely try that out though, and it's a good skill to use for several different types of drawings. I think architectural drawings really a cross hatch could, maybe that could be like a brick texture or something that has a little bit more texture to it. Okay, so next one's fun. So scribble. There might be a better technical term for this, but that's what I'm calling it because that's what I feel like I do. So like I said, this I use for insides of like a sunflower, or maybe if you're doing more of like a landscape drawing too, that you're like zoomed out a little bit more. So this might be tree leaves or a bush, or so I just kind of start with some scribbling lines. But what I'm trying to do is make them fairly inconsistent. Like I don't want to sit here and Like that's a pretty consistent scribble, right? Kind of like S shapes, figure eights. So trying to make it look pretty random because again, in nature, nothing is quite perfect. Maybe just a few little ones out there. And then keep going back in here and add more layers. For some reason I find when I scribble too, I grip my pen pretty tight. So I'm trying to get a little bit better at that. And maybe at the end too, when it gets into white, maybe say if it's a leaf, like, or you know, that zoomed out tree, maybe I see just one little leaf. But it's pretty surprising too, kind of, yeah, in a more landscape sort of drawing, how this ends up looking pretty realistic, or at least to me it does. So it's a good technique, I think, for those things that kind of have more of a looped texture. I think, yeah, the middle of a sunflower, I think technically, if I wanted to draw it super accurately, it might be like these little U shapes. But this to me depicts it pretty well. So it's kind of like simplifying what your eye sees. And you get those scribbles. So there's kind of my gradation using a scribble. And the last one, again, the one I think looks beautiful. I think it is very appropriate for a flower. Like I said, the crosshatch seems a little like rough to me, but the hatch seems to depict something softer, a softer texture. I think stipple is definitely probably the softest texture, but it just takes a really long time. So I'm probably not going to do a full gradation here because it does take a while. What I do find too is for a stipple, oftentimes, so I said I usually use the O2, I might go to something a little bit thicker just so when I like make a dot, like even this is the 08 and that even still made a really small dot, just so it makes a little bit of a bigger dot. Otherwise it's going to look really fine. So again, I try to think, okay, not too many dots when I get towards the white end, but let's kind of add one layer in here. I find too when I stipple, I do hold my pen pretty straight up and down. Otherwise I end up kind of like almost getting little like check marks, which if your texture, like that might be appropriate actually for your texture, that might be fine, but for a true stipple, you're trying to get more of a dot. So kind of starting adding layers and getting a real dark here. So, I mean, if anybody's ever taken drawing classes and you have a full classroom of people stippling on their desk, you know, kind of that noise that it makes. So you could see like to get a true black with a stipple, like even though I am going for a true black, like I still don't want to like do that and then start stippling. Like you will be able to tell even when you're going for your true black which direction your lines are going. Like that actually will matter. So I never really want to do that. I still want to use my same technique even if I'm trying to go for like a solid black. So I think even just, yeah, the texture of the way that your pen goes onto paper, like you will see that in your drawing, and I think it makes a difference. So okay, like I said, I'm not going to go through and do my full stipple here, but I think you can see like same technique that I'm just adding layers on, trying to get that value, being careful not to add too many dots when I get to the end here. So yeah, I've seen like a whole rose done in stipple. I drew a map not too long ago and kind of the coastline. This was kind of like my sand, so that was like a nice way to kind of soften up instead of just a solid line when I went from land to water, so that's good. So I think it's good, yeah, to learn these different techniques and really practice and kind of then study your reference and evaluate like what technique is going to be appropriate for this flower, for whatever it is that you're drawing. Like I'm trying to use these different techniques to depict texture. So what sort of texture does that look like? So I mean, this is good to just do little side sketches, or maybe you do this in your sketchbook, which that pen's about dying. So like I know we're talking about florals, and but like what could a brick look like? Like I could draw just the outline like that, or maybe I do it with hatch lines, because maybe that I think is more appropriate for the texture of that. Or maybe I think like a crosshatch. So I think doing little studies to try to figure out what sort of drawing technique is appropriate for your certain application will make your drawings a lot better. So, okay. So that's going all the way through kind of our basic pen drawing techniques. So how am I going to use a pen rather than a pencil? Because again, pencil, I feel like it's pretty logical that how you shade with a pencil. So pen drawing is something I think that's different for a lot of people. It's not something you started with in school, so this is more what you understand. So how do we achieve this with a pen? So I would advise going pretty slow at the beginning. I think going slow will help you start to get almost like that muscle memory of like, how am I putting my pen down? And when I draw, I am going slow. Like doing these sort of things, like I kind of wanted to get through them to get through the basic idea of it, but I would say this is probably about my pace for drawing. Again, I feel like Instagram and YouTube, everything is like sped up too, right? To fit within that 15 to the 30 seconds. So you never quite know like how fast is somebody drawing, which is difficult. Like, so you kind of set these unrealistic expectations for yourself that, oh, I should be doing this, right? No, like I can't do that consistently. So, I mean, my pace is usually pretty slow. I mean, it's something I like because I feel like it's pretty methodical too, like a little bit meditative. So I mean, I'll probably end up saying this again, but the example rose that I drew, let's see. So this, I think it took me like to draw the structure of it. So we're going to go through that today, kind of getting that structure down. I think that took me about 45 minutes to do. And then like getting all the detail lines, which this one, because of the size of it, like this is, I think, pretty accurate to the size that I drew this. I used quite a few detail lines. So if you're drawing something smaller, like you probably won't add quite as many, but I think drawing the detail lines in this took me about an hour and a half. So it is a slow process for me, but something that I enjoy it. So yes, go slowly. Make sure you get that consistency. Your hand eventually kind of, I don't know, it gets like trained, to like set your pen down, take it up. So you start not like crossing lines where you don't want to cross lines. And so I would recommend going slowly, yes. Okay, any other questions? So I have a question about your little pen tip here. So I had this problem too, that either it felt like the pen tip was kind of like wearing out, or it gets, I think you're saying yours kind of gets like pushed in. There's like the little metal bit. Sorry, I'm trying to find a spot. Oh, that looks pretty clear. There's kind of little metal bit, and then you have like your little felt tip that kind of comes out. So I think I found this from calligraphy too, that we're not really taught how to hold a pen anymore. Like when you are taught, well, anymore, I mean, by the time it was like 30 years ago, I learned how to write, right? Like your initial letters, but nobody ever said like, how do I hold my pen? So actually when I learned, or I guess I didn't learn, but I always used to hold my pen on my ring finger. So I think I changed it eventually to my middle finger because I think that's a little bit more appropriate. So I think if you're finding your tip wears out pretty quickly or starts to push in, you're probably pushing too hard. So I would try to like lighten my grip a little bit. Sometimes it helps too, like if I'm right here, if I'm gripping it close to the end, that's when I try to like push hard. So maybe as an experiment, see if you can hold it a little bit farther back. So I feel like this helps lighten up your strokes a little bit, and it also changes the angle that your hand is to your paper. So if you're holding it close, I feel like you end up being more upright, and that I think can make that tip push in a little bit. But if you're holding it farther back, it kind of forces you to have a little bit of an angle of your pen to the paper. So that helps lighten it up a little bit, which I think I did have a tendency to do this at first too, because I want like ultimate control, right, of how I'm drawing my lines. But again, with floral drawing, I feel like it is a little bit more freeing because like I don't need to draw that like perfect line and then perfectly at 90 degrees. Like I'm not trying to draw that. So it's a little bit more freeing that you can be a little bit looser with it and maybe hold your pen a little bit farther out. So contour, first of all, just the concept of it in general. So when we're drawing on a two-dimensional surface, right? But we're most likely drawing things that have more dimension to it, that are in 3 dimensions. So we now need to use those strokes that we just practiced in order to depict 3 dimensions within our 2-dimensional drawing. So how do we do that? So for contour, I have some kind of simple examples here. So it is helpful, I think, almost anything, any reference that you see, trying to break it down into more simple shapes, at least at first, is a real easy way to think about it. It helps a lot to try to figure out like, what should my pen be doing? Am I doing a straight line? Am I doing a curved line? Which direction should the curve go? So I start from here just because I think it's the easiest way to actually start to think about it. So if you're drawing contour, you're going to want your line to follow the surface that you're drawing. So for a cube, all of our surfaces are flat. So for anything flat, you're going to be drawing a straight line. So that's pretty simple, right? Once you start getting into things that are curved, that's when it gets a little bit more complicated. So say this cylinder here. So the end of a cylinder is still flat, just like the cube. So my lines are still going to be straight there. But now you're getting a surface that, if I'm looking at it in this direction, that's actually flat. So those lines are straight, but it curves in this other direction. So for drawing terms, you might consider this, your contour goes this way. This is my cross contour going the other way. So you might hear me say that of cross contour. And then your sphere, you're curving in both directions, right? So it's curving this direction if I'm drawing my lines that way. It's curving in this direction if I'm drawing my lines that way. So the way that you're drawing your lines is kind of depicting that this is a sphere. It's curving in both directions. So in the back of the booklet, I had some little props. There's a couple different ones that you can, I mean, if you don't have them cut out now, that's fine. Just, I'm going to give myself a little bit more room here. But I think these are an interesting way to try to understand. So here, if I hold the paper so it's flat, that's a flat surface, all my lines are straight. So I can take this though and make a cylinder. So now you can see still my lines going in that direction, straight. My lines going the other direction are a little lighter, but you can kind of see if I can darken this up a little bit. There we go. You can see now going in this direction, I'm curving in that direction, so my lines are curved. Let's see if I can there block some light, you can see it. So that's kind of going from flat surfaces from a cube to a cylinder. And I had to raid my cat's toys to try to find something that was kind of spherical. So here's a little ball that I just took, and I draw lines just going around the circumference of the sphere. So you can see the line that I'm looking at, that I go straight, or I'm looking at it straight on, so that line still is straight. So even within the sphere, there will be something, whatever's kind of like right in the middle of your sight line will be straight. So this actually will come into when we get into shading petals, that there will be at some point something that's pretty straight in the middle, but then it curves kind of one direction and curves the other. So for a sphere, we start to slightly curve to the right here as we go to the right, get a little bit farther and a little bit farther. So I have a little bit more lines on here than in my prop, but you can see how it starts to curve that way. When you start going left of that kind of center point, now my lines are starting to curve to the left. So you see the way in which you draw your lines is what's going to give that three-dimensional shape. Okay, so that's kind of the first concept of which direction am I going to draw my line? Is it curved? Is it curved in what direction? Is it straight? So the way you draw your lines is going to start to give that shape. And then the second concept, so this is almost like the equivalent of our basic strokes, right? Like our hatch, cross hatch, like that's kind of the simple version. Then the next version, this is adding that value aspect to it. So now we need to start thinking about light and shadow and which direction your light is coming from. So for our cube here, if my light is kind of coming from the right-hand side here, this side of it is going to be kind of the most direct light. You're getting your direct sunlight here. This side, I mean, if I'm maybe down a little bit of an angle here, you're still going to be getting some light here, but not quite as much. And then this side doesn't get hardly any, so that's your darkest shadow. So again, I'm just using my straight lines because this is a flat surface. Get them really kind of spaced out on that side of the cube that you're getting the most direct sunlight. Space them a little bit closer on this side, that's kind of in that medium tone, and then space them real close to get your dark shadow. So that's pretty simple. Again, everything's straight. So now what do I do when I get to curved surfaces? So again, if light's coming this direction, you're going to kind of get like a hot spot at some point. So maybe my light is kind of hitting in this area of the cylinder. So that's going to be, you know, on our spectrum or our scale, that'll be that bright white. And now you're going to slowly get darker and darker, whether you're adding layers or you're just spacing your lines closer and closer until you get to the bottom, and then you're going to have kind of like your deepest color there. And again, even thinking about, it's kind of like the cube here, that our end of the cube wasn't getting any sunlight, so that's the deepest shadow. So my lines again are straight because that's still straight, a flat surface there, but we space them close together. And then the most complicated here is our sphere. So again, you're getting kind of a, say, I'm imagining that's kind of where my sunlight is hitting that hot spot right there. And then I'm using my line still going in the direction of the contour. So you always want your lines to go in that contour because that's going to be what gives it that shape. And then you're going to kind of space it out. So let's say, so there's kind of my next value shade right there. That's kind of a medium, a little bit darker, and then your darkest is your spot away from the light. So again, I did this here by adding layers of my hatching, actually, which you could use cross hatching here too. So if I wanted to add, turn my paper a little bit here. If you wanted to add another layer, maybe I want this to be a little bit darker. Find a pen that works. Here we go. I can add more lines in here. But as long as I'm adding lines in the direction of the contour, so it's curved in both directions, so I want my my lines to still be curved if I'm trying to depict the sphere. So I could draw lines in that direction. If I wanted to keep kind of maybe do a crosshatch, I can keep kind of adding them at different angles, but thinking about how I'm drawing these lines like around a circle, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's kind of a simplified version, thinking about basic shapes, thinking about a cube, a cylinder, and a sphere.